All right. Well, thank you, Sheta. And it is sobering that going into COP26, the world was based on policies that were actually in place. Total warming, we were headed towards 2.7 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the lower numbers that you saw in the media are based on promises. And I think after 3 decades of inaction, Greta Thunberg is right to call that all blah, blah, blah for now. The net zero pledges for 2050, 2060, and even 2070, that's 30, 40, 50 years from now. We need a lot more zero and a lot less net. That's why I'm glad to be here for the business panel, because the business panel is not waiting 30, 40, or 50 years. In fact, we have, I think, Patagonia here. Their net zero pledges for 2025. And we actually have a company that is putting out carbon neutral net zero products today. So, I think we're definitely going to need a strong, active role of business. So let me introduce my 3 panelists. Marcus Lovell Smith is CEO of Neutral Foods Incorporated, a company funded by Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Ventures and Mark Cuban to bring carbon neutral foods to market, starting with dairy milk. Neutral works directly with dairy farmers to reduce the climate impact of their operations. Marcus Smith is such a Renaissance man that he was Chief Technology Officer at Google Fiber, but he's also a dairy farmer in New Hampshire. Please. Adheer Bahulkar is a managing director and the North American supply chain lead for consumers at Accenture. He is an advisor to global brands and retailers on growth and operation strategy. Of specific interest to him is the challenge before brands to deliver on ESG expectations. Adheer has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Advertising Age, Women's Wear Daily, NPR, Marketplace, Bloomberg, Business Insider, among others. And is Avi Garbow? Yeah. Very good. Avi Garbow is Patagonia's environmental advocate, helping to sharpen and strengthen the company's voice and vision on environmental issues. But Avi took leave and served as the senior counselor to Biden's EPA administrator. So are you currently Patagonia or Biden?
I'm back at Patagonia.
Back at Patagonia. Avi served as general counsel at EPA from 2013 to 2017, the longest to hold that position, which I guess shows you how difficult that position is. Without further ado, I will join them up here, and I'd like to start by having all 3 of you answer the question: what is the role of the private sector in confronting the climate crisis, and can you discuss this more specifically related to your company and sector? And why don't we start with Marcus?
Thank you so much for the introduction. I think to me it's clearly central. I mean, and you asked for me to be specific. I mean, in the area of dairy milk, 93% of Americans have dairy milk in their refrigerators. People are increasingly understanding the huge impact agriculture and food have on climate change. So you have to confront those. So that's why we're here.
I think in some ways, the existential crisis we are anticipating as individuals, for corporations, it's actually today. And their brand reputations are at risk, their livelihoods are at risk, their shareholder interests are at risk. And I think a lot of practical solutions, innovations, and bold moves are happening in businesses today, which don't often get celebrated, but I think that's where kind of what we see and kind of what we do, we really see businesses at the forefront at solving some of the biggest challenges today.
So I'll take a step back and tell you how I think how we think about our role when it comes to addressing our climate crisis. I kind of approach it in three ways. The first is that we at Patagonia, and I think businesses writ large, obviously should play a role. We pollute, right? We are the emitters. And I think we have to take responsibility for our manufacturing. That includes our supply chain. We have to take responsibility for the services and the goods that we provide. And we're contributing to this climate crisis. We need to contribute to the solution. I should also point out, just apropos of one of the earlier panels, we talk about a just transition and community groups and fence line communities. These are the fences of companies. This is business. And they have an obligation, I think, particularly with respect to those frontline and fence line communities, to be part of this solution and to, if not make room at the table, to cede the table to the voices of those, I think, who have been far too long disenfranchised. We can make a difference. We're here less than a mile from the U.S. Capitol, and when you think of gridlock, you think of traffic and politics. You don't necessarily think of boardrooms in companies. And we have, I think, a unique capacity to actually make decisions and move things forward swiftly. We can lead by example in ways that governments cannot in certain respects. And certainly when you think about what's behind us, we don't have time. I think all of us understand and can appreciate that time is ticking. And we can't simply wait for the politics to kind of come around and provide the solutions. Businesses can do it today and ought to be leading. And finally, I think the most obvious point is we must be part of this solution. We've heard that the adage, there's no business on a dead planet, but we don't even have to go that far to really understand the intersection between good business and healthy communities and a stable climate. So, for all of those reasons, Patagonia, and we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, about this, have tried to be as aggressive. We approach this as much with our ears and in a learning mode as we do with our feet and in an action mode. And I think, we need to figure out ways of multiplying that boldness and that sense of action throughout the entire corporate community.
Well, that's great, and I'll follow up right on what you said. I'd like all three of you to answer the question: how are you positioning your company in the climate and sustainability landscape? Start with you, Marcus.
I think it's that incredible recognition that something like 37%, and that number moves around, but a very large part of impact comes from food and agriculture, which is why we've started there. I think we wouldn't have had this conversation 5 or 10, even 5 years ago, but I think the understanding that there's the potential for neutral foods generally for people to start. And I think we might regard ourselves as the first pure play carbon neutral food company, but I think it's it's a new category. I think maybe 4% of milk is currently organic, and maybe 5% of people are vegetarian. But there's something like 60% of people who are either deeply alarmed or concerned about climate change. And I think we see a carbon neutral set of milk products as a stepping stone to people to start to think about these decisions. And I think what excited me, and I think excited you mentioned breakthrough about it. It turns a decision. It's an everyday decision that people make, and it brings climate change into an everyday decision. These are great decisions to make, but a Prius might be once every 5 years, and your solar panels might be once every 10 years. But this is a way to think. It was just six inches to the left and right, and I think that we'll see an increasing number of these products. And it's interesting. It's great to go on stage with Patagonia, because Patagonia started a provisions company, just for example, and we're thinking about many of the same things.
I think the way we like to think about is what we can do for our clients, consumer brands, retailers, some of the things that you use every day is give them courage, give them creativity, and give them good consumer stories to tell. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about each of those. But to be very specific, let's take a product that all of us can relate with, right? Apparel. And there are some alarming statistics which you may or may not know, but between the years of 2000 and 2015, the actual dollar market size for apparel more or less remains stagnant. Just inflation, 1-2% globally. The number of units produced doubled, and the average unit price at retail kind of went half. And today, average American produces 75 pounds of apparel waste, textile waste every year. So when we kind of sit down with brands to say, okay, let's go tackle climate change, it's really the consumer that is the biggest impact in all of this. And yes, there is aspects of courage, right? To say, how do we make bold investments? How do we get ahead of the curve? How do we bring in some strong kind of AI solutions to better plan inventory and where do we place products, et cetera? There's a lot of aspects in here about creativity, right? Today, we're bringing together companies like staunch competitors to start collaborating on new technologies, to start collaborating on shared collaboration platforms. Both of us don't need distribution centers. Maybe we can use the same distribution center, right? But I think the consumer storytelling is the biggest missing link. And I think that's where we're really working hard to say, how do we create and influence consumers the right way? And especially what we also see, and this may be a little bit taboo even in this audience, but the Generation Z and Generation Millennials, there's a lot of duplicity that we see kind of when we sit down and really look at the data, because you see a lot of kind of voicing of strong passion and kind of climate change and activism, but they don't follow through necessarily in their purchasing decisions, right? And as brands, this becomes a question of survival, to say, how do we really kind of talk to the consumer in a way that's actually kind of influencing them to make the right choices, right? You don't need to, some 40% of 15 to 25-year-olds feel tremendous pressure not to wear the same apparel or same item twice. Just imagine, right? Kind of how much waste is that creating? So I think that's where we see a big opportunity, Joe, to say, how do we help clients and how do we help brands kind of come forward with the right stories to influence consumer behaviors? That's a big opportunity for us.
I think, and I know you didn't mean this when you said, how do we position ourselves with respect to climate? I mean, we are far less concerned, I think, with what we say than what we do. And just to pick up on a point you made in your introduction, also far more concerned with more zero and less net. And so, we are looking at every opportunity that we can to have absolute emissions reductions, rather than seeing how we can kind of net things out down the road. And that requires the hard work in our supply chain. 90+% of our emissions are scope 3. They come from our suppliers. They're in our materials, and we are responsible for that. And I would also say just one other point in terms of how we think about this. I'd like to think it's with brutal honesty and transparency. What happens in the back office is the same what happens in the front office. And there are many companies, not saying any represented here, who go out and advocate for, the Build Back Better, bill, or, climate programs, et cetera, and then fund organizations that are lobbying on the Hill, a half a mile from here to undermine those. And that's not what we're about at Patagonia. We want to make sure that when you hear us speak, there's some integrity there. And again, it's owning up to our responsibility in this space to address the climate crisis.
That's great. Well, I want to sort of follow up on that a little bit. Greta said before COP26, I think this is a direct quote, net zero in 2050, blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 carbon neutral, blah, blah, blah. So it's obviously a controversial subject. How do you all address, the skepticism that has started to arise over all of these sort of lofty claims?
That's so fair. She was so right in saying that. The first thing I did 20 years ago when I came to America was be a dairy farmer, and I think it was literally the hardest job I've ever had. And I ran a family dairy farm for 3 or 4 years. I don't run it day to day, hence I'm here. Otherwise, I'd be milking. But to me, you address it really deeply in your supply chains. We've moved from a world of offsets to what's increasingly been called a world of insets. So most of what we do is work directly with farmers, and that's the most gratifying thing for me. Is how do we make serious climate change impacts at the farm level? And there's barely a farmer I've met that doesn't want to engage. They see themselves as natural stewards of the land. They feel sometimes put on the wrong side of that fence, and they don't feel as though they should be. And they're just super keen to engage with projects. So we're doing a whole bunch of projects, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, but increasingly over the US. And it's just fascinating stuff, from reseeding pastures to manure. Let's not talk about manure, but we do a lot of that too. But to me, the authenticity piece is the work that we do directly with farmers.
Imagine a room with corporations, businesses, policymakers, and consumers and investors. My experience has been that kind of businesses are often the most well-intentioned and clear-headed about what needs to happen. And more often than not, they're the smartest people in the room as well. And let me explain kind of where the issues are. At the end of the day, businesses, the whole panel is going to role of business. We got to be clear what's the purpose of a business, right? And the purpose of a business, in the most kind of simplistic term, is to create shareholder value. And as a society, we choose to define shareholder value as quarterly gains and profits, so be it. If the rules of the game change and we choose to define shareholder value as something else, then businesses will do that. The single biggest problem for so-called good companies, right? Good companies meaning well-intentioned, they're doing good things, making smart choices, like Patagonia, of course, is, are they really being rewarded by the shareholders? Are they really being rewarded by the investors? And the answer today is simply no. And the reason is there is no set scorecard. A lot of what kind of gets reported is self-reported. A lot of gets kind of reported is through kind of more generalized metrics. And everybody's using a different scorecard. If you try to look up sustainability metrics of a given brand or a given company, for the same company, for the same time period, you will see dramatic differences. In one index, it'll look red, in another index, it'll look green. As an investor, there's no way I can differentiate kind of where to go, where do I invest, how do I make smart choices. So I think that's going to really, kind of, the burden is on the policymakers, the burden is on kind of the accounting of sustainability, where until we have the right scorecard, and until we can kind of report on the right metrics, the good companies are going to be continue to get penalized, and the not so good companies are getting a free pass. And I think that's where kind of we are seeing a lot of motivation from the big corporations, the big brands across different sectors, definitely a lot more in consumer than others, is how do we start influencing the investors, right? How do we start kind of supporting common standards and metrics? And there's a role for technology, but there's a role for policymakers as well. I think that's where we're hoping to see some big action, because the role of business is paramount, but I think the ecosystem needs to work. There needs to be a good scorecard, so good actions get rewarded as well.
I think, we heard Greta loud and clear, and the way I think we approach it is commitments are good, but they're not enough. Commitments lead to goals, goals lead to strategies, strategies lead to actions, and as you work down that kind of action-oriented food chain, I think that's where the transparency is most important. It's most opaque when you kind of come out in a public setting and you announce your net zero commitment of whatever it is. But it's those actions and the budget decisions that drive them, I think, that are critical. And I think part of the problem as well that we're all facing, as folks here have alluded to, is that people are making commitments decades out. It is today's actions, today's budgetary decisions that set in motion the progress to meet those commitments, and that's where there's a lack of transparency and a lack of understanding. And I think that's really what Greta and others are appropriately calling out.
It's great, thank you, Marcus. So your company has not one but two billionaires investing. Tell us a little bit about how your company story inspired them.
Thank you. Yeah, I had the fortune of also being working with Breakthrough Energy for the last 3 years, sitting on their commercial advisory board. So I've seen a fascinating group. I think it's nearly 65 companies go through Breakthrough Energy, you know, across the whole panoply of fusion to battery recycling to electric airplanes. To, and they're a very, very thesis-driven fund, and they think very deeply. And I think if they hadn't found neutral, they would have started it themselves. I think they saw neutral foods, and we're just one part of that as a totally new category. Is not as profitable in itself, but also as a stepping stone to a lot of change. So I was very fortunate to get involved in neutral. It was really through Breakthrough Energy, and Mark Cuban. I think, I mean, it's interesting. So many of his new investments are around food as well. I think, and we're going to be hopefully we're going to be announcing some new things very shortly. But I think it just shows how much interest there is in food and ag as one of those five pillars of climate change: in buildings, energy, transport, and industry, and ag, and the central role of agriculture and food. So I think that's caught their attention.
That's great. Thank you. Appreciate that. I've got a question now for Adheer and Avi, which Adheer kind of raised earlier. So this question of disposable clothing, people can't wear the same outfit. People have to buy whatever is, you know, the new thing. Obviously, that is driving a lot of excess consumption. And, you know, in some sense, capitalism is built around persuading people that what they have currently, it doesn't satisfy all their needs. And how do you, get companies to address this issue, particularly given that selling products is how the company makes money in the first place? And if their products lasted forever and you only bought one of them, it would be hard to make a living.
Sure. And as you can imagine, it's a self-inflicted problem, because I think the same companies a couple of decades ago came up with the idea of fast fashion are now kind of trying to figure out, okay, how do we work against that? And we're just focusing on one sector, but we can parlay this to any sector and same story. I think there are creative opportunities to kind of really shift the storylines, right? So the shared economy, many of us and a lot of folks are familiar with the Airbnb model, right? And now that shared economy model is now translating into different sectors, including apparel and jewelry and watches, right? I think that's one example where brands can kind of start owning that circulation of products amongst their consumer bases. And I think we expect to see kind of some really good innovation through kind of supported by blockchain technology and others to say, how do we kind of create that ecosystem where consumers can kind of seamlessly exchange products, even if they're wearing it just once, but they're able to easily pass on to the next consumer and the next consumer, and the brand still benefits from it, right? I think that's the solution, and this is just one illustration of how kind of some good creativity can kind of really kind of bring about the consumer to kind of warm up to more sustainable choices and decisions as well. And I think this is also where we see kind of there's a bit of a need for popular momentum behind this idea about fast fashion, right? And how do we use the voices of this generation, right? Whether it's Greta or whether it's kind of, we just heard from Lysandra earlier here, is those need to gain a lot more momentum, right? And those need to create a lot more pull from the brands, because today, honestly, brands are getting a free pass, right? A couple of decades ago, I'm sure many of you here are familiar with Zara. It was a kind of dramatic innovation when they started launching kind of few hundred new products every week. But today, like brands like ASOS, I mean, they release 5,000, 7,000 new products every week, right? So I think kind of that hunger, that demand, that thirst from the consumers needs to be curtailed, right? And I think kind of how do we celebrate more sustainable choices? How do we kind of create easy, seamless mechanisms for circulation of product and create more sort of a end-of-life kind of outcomes that consumers feel good about is really a big kind of opportunity.
Look. I think it's not rocket science. If you don't need it, don't buy it. If you own it, keep it and repair it if it's got a problem. If it can't be repaired, figure out a way to reconstitute it as something else. Re-gift it. We've talked about if it's old to me, it's new to you. So, folks have an opportunity. If you've got a Patagonia jacket and you don't want it anymore, give it to somebody else. So there are innumerable ways, not just at Patagonia, but at in other companies to, again, resell things. You talk about it's good for the brand. We've got a whole warmwear business where you get credit and we'll resell these things. It's fine for the brand, but it's also got about a half less carbon footprint associated with that new that item that's being resold. So I think, and there are a lot of companies, I think, to be fair, that are figuring out the rental market. They're figuring out the how to bring used clothing into their kind of marketplace. A lot of opportunities, certainly in the apparel sector. We contribute a lot to landfills. There are a lot of ways to resolve that.
Can I just say, no, it's just sort of super fascinating listening to you talk about that. I mean, you say it's not rocket science, but you still have to be brave. And I'm a big advocate, so I'm showing my colors here of Patagonia, but I received a Patagonia brochure the other day in the mail. I couldn't find any clothes in it. There was no clothes in it. It was just about everything else other than clothes. I mean, but you have to be pretty brave to do that. And I challenge our own team to think about how we can be sort of kind of front forward, thinking forward like that, just like that.
Wasn't sure if I was going to ask this question, but the net in net zero is offsets. And after you're done reducing emissions, to your satisfaction or to the satisfaction of one of your partners, then you pay someone else to reduce their emissions. To actually explain this is coming out of COP26. People were very excited that they established trading rules and offset rules. Countries like Brazil didn't want rich countries to be able to come in, let's say, pay to shut down a coal plant, and then the rich country or the company gets to count that emissions reduction, but Brazil doesn't. Brazil wanted to also count it. The coal plant shut, that counts as their own emissions reduction, but obviously that would be double counting. So they've now left it so that there is no double counting, which means that rich country pays to shut down a coal plant in Brazil. The rich country gets to keep polluting that amount. Brazil has to pretend that that coal plant is still running. Otherwise, it would be double counting. So Brazil has to come up with another set of reductions for itself to displace the coal plant that doesn't exist anymore. And if that sounds to you, dubious, it is very dubious. And if you don't understand it, and I barely understand it, then you're definitely not alone. But I'd be interested in all of your comments on offsets, because I know that you're all involved with them one way or another.
Okay. Well, just quickly on that, I mean, and for us, it's all about insets, as I said, I mentioned before, rather than offsets. Offsets are fine, and they have genuine benefit. But I think each of the industries, whether it's the oil and gas industry or the cement industry or the agricultural industry, they need to work inside their industry to progressively and incrementally and relentlessly reduce their impact. So thinking about your utility example, they should think as much as possible about their direct source of pollution, whether it be scope 1, 2, or even 3, and reduce that rather than necessary. As still, an offset is better than nothing, but I think an inset is really where you need to go.
And to be clear, for those who don't know, scope 3 emissions are the emissions of your suppliers or, I guess, your customers. Although it's open to some debate, and there's a lot of controversy over this.
I completely agree with Marcus, and businesses don't like offsets. It's kind of boring from Peter to pay Tom, and it's not a sustainable idea to promote sustainability. I think the other truth though also is that standalone companies are not going to be able to make the improvements needed. It's just evidently clear, because every single day we sit down and create business cases for choices that we could be making, and it's extremely clear that standalone companies will not be able to kind of really move the needle the way it needs to move. And I think that's where kind of really big decisions are going to be needed. So give you one example. Staunch competitors are now coming together to collaborate on things that even as recently as 3 years ago, they would have never even thought possible, right? And some publicly available ideas that I can share is like, today, Starbucks products and Chobani products, they travel on PepsiCo supply chains. Walmart just announced that they're going to deliver Home Depot products, right? And there's such a huge kind of emphasis within corporations, which is so good to see, that they are very, very willing to sit down with their competitors to say, okay, how do we collapse our supply chains? How do we kind of really collaborate and reduce our excesses, right? How do I avoid empty lane miles and empty trucks kind of going nowhere, burning fuel, right? How do I kind of avoid underutilization of my $3 million square foot distribution center, which is only running half the times, right? So I think we really see kind of offsets are not really kind of part of the big solve. I think the big solve from a business perspective is going to be kind of more courage, but I think kind of really creating more shared platform and collaboration to come up with the big ideas for tomorrow.
I think for us, kind of in this pecking order, science-based targets and absolute reductions, to insetting, and a lot of the work is and needs to be done in our supply chain, getting our suppliers to wean off fossil fuels and to actually for us to invest in these opportunities and projects for them. But 3, I think we need to acknowledge, as you do, that unless you produce nothing with no emissions, the only way you get to a net zero is through, I think, an offsetting mechanism. We've not yet made offsets in that regard. I think our focus and our dollars right now are on the first 2, but I think we acknowledge that given our goals and what we'd like to do, we're going to get there. We're going to get there in a way that feels right to Patagonia. It's focused on nature-based solutions that leans into, I think, indigenous and other communities in terms of those areas where the offsets could be most additive to community health as well. But readily acknowledge the intricacies and the problems that you've raised.
Well, appreciate that, and appreciate that we have some enlightened companies on stage, because the offset market is going to hit $1 billion this year, and it is forecast to just go crazy because every company in every country has announced a net zero target. So that creates a market, and unfortunately, the money goes to projects that probably would have happened anyway, or don't reduce pollution, or as you say, they introduce crops that aren't suitable for the indigenous people. So this is definitely going to be one of the thorniest issues. Well, promise, Shetta, I would end before 4:20.
Amazing.
So here we are. Thank you very much.